If you're concerned about your credit history, you're not alone. According to the Federal Reserve, Americans owe more than $1 trillion in credit card debt. Now, that's even more than what was owed during the financial crisis. Marcus Garrett is the host of the podcast Paychecks and Balances and the author of Debt Free or Die Trying. He joins us now to discuss. Marcus, how could rising interest rates impact credit card debt?
Well, I think for everyone, that's obviously going to mean more debt that you have to pay back. Having a low credit score or having high interest rates can be the difference between $1,000 or $10,000, depending on the size of the purchase. As far as time frame for young students who are coming out of school, that might be the difference between paying off debt in their 20s versus their 30s or 40s and still carrying that burden.
So, Marcus, what is considered a good credit score and why is it so important? I know there are several tiers of credit.
Right. Generally speaking, the credit score is going to range from 300 to 800 or above. Most people fall in the 600 to 750 range. So a good credit score is going to be 700, and then you'll start to move up to about 730 is when you'll start to get some of the best rates that you see out there when you're applying for, that you see in the ads. And then an excellent credit score would be 800 or above.
Now, you have an individual or personal story with credit card debt. You dug yourself out of a pile of debt. Is that right? Tell us about that.
Well, I also buried myself in a pile of debt. So when I graduated from school, I actually only had about $9,000 in credit card debt. I had gone to what I think a lot of students can relate to now, the main hall, and they were giving away swag, as we called it, t-shirts. I think I got a yo-yo, signed up for my first credit card. Before I graduated, I had 3 credit cards, and I spread $9,000 in debt across them. So the book, Debt Free or Die Trying, How I Buried Myself in $30,000, actually happened shortly thereafter that. I went and applied for a consolidation loan. I didn't even know what a consolidation loan was. It looked good. The marketing was really pretty. And they mailed me a $10,000 check, and I spent it like a lottery ticket. And I ultimately ended up buying a car with rims, which this is everyone's favorite story. It's also my most painful. And by the time that weekend was over, I had about $27,000 in debt. But I wasn't done. I also then went out and got a flat screen TV, which I tell people cost about $3,000. They're about $300 right now. My grandchildren might be paying off that TV, but it feels like a child of mine. So that's about how I got to $30,000 in debt. And what I tell people is that 72-hour experience actually spent 7 years then paying off that debt. So it's definitely not worth it.
So what advice then do you have for other individuals struggling with a bad credit score? Where should they start in their effort to return to good standing?
Well, for me, it was really helpful, and I remember having those phone calls and what I call rock bottom when I was begging for my next consolidation loan, now $20,000 additional in debt, and I didn't know what was going to happen if I didn't get this consolidation loan. And I told myself that I would never put myself in that position again. I had no idea where I was going to start, and I think I'm old enough now to say back in my day, and so I got online and I literally wrote it down. And so from that, I tell people the first step is to come up with a plan. So I use debt just to keep it easy. So define the problem. Most people don't even know how much debt they have. They're just making the minimum payments. That's exactly what I was doing. And then I was working 3 jobs, and I didn't even have enough to make those minimum payments. So I went out and I got my credit report from annualcreditreport.com, which is freely available to everyone. And then I say establish the problem, establish your plan. So I went to Bankrate. There's a lot of good resources out there now. NerdWallet also has a lot of good tools. And how long is it going to take you to pay this back, and is that reasonable? I remember when I was 22, I just said, I'll get out of debt in 5 years with no plan, which I might as well say I'll own a unicorn. And so I tell people to come up with something reasonable that fits into your B budget. For me, that was a 50-30-20 budget, so 50 for needs, 30 for wants, and then 20 for being responsible. So I paid down that debt and I started having savings, and that's how I ultimately paid it off. And then T is trust the process. For the millennials out there is just stick to the plan, and the time will pass anyway, so you can define where you're going to be in those next 5 years.
So, Marcus, I imagine in your journey you learned a lot about the credit scoring process, which does remain a bit of a mystery to many people. Can you tell us what is one thing that could hurt your credit score that most people may not know about?
I've heard a lot of people on our podcast that you mentioned, they call in and they say, well, I'll carry a balance because someone told me that's what you're supposed to do. And that's actually false, but it seems to be something that a lot of people think is true. So if at all possible, actually you want to pay off your balance in full every month. And what I tell people, if it's a bill that you already have, Netflix or Uber, something that you're already automatically doing and paying off, just set up those automatic payments. And so you're carrying a zero balance, but you're still building that positive credit history, and that will be reported to the bureaus, and then that will be reflected in your score.
And what about late payments? Is that something that can ding you as well?
Yes, it is, but I wouldn't say all hope is not lost. If you make a late payment, especially if it's not habitual, I tell people the first thing to do is to reach out to the lender and tell them and explain the circumstance, and they have the ability, especially if it's the exception, to write that off. So I tell people to call that credit card company and say, this was an exception, I missed the bill, to explain the circumstance. And you have everything to gain, so escalate it if you need to. If the person on the phone isn't willing to do so, can I speak to a manager? But make sure that it's a priority, and then also point to the positive payments that you've made in the past. And then if that doesn't work out, you might want to look for other credit card opportunities, or just to reestablish that history. The 1/3 of your score is actually positive payment history, so you want to ensure that that's a priority.
It's good to know that you can keep that line of communication open with your lender, and that can actually help.
Yep.
I think a lot of people aren't aware of that. All right, Marcus, Garrett, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you for having me.